Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning, we're very privileged to start off with a discussion with Amory Lovins, who's the co-founder and chief scientist of the Rocky Mountain Institute, prolific author, and of course, a pioneering advocate of energy and resource efficiency. Dr. Lovins and his colleagues have come out with a new book, appropriately titled for this conference, Reinventing Fire. It's a very dense work, very heavy, full of all kinds of data and stories. Highly recommended as a handbook or a manifesto or a reference work. There's so much in here that summarizing it would take up the time we have. So I think I'll start by asking Dr. Lovins just to give us the background to the general statement in the book that it's possible to have a U.S. economy that has grown 158% by the year 2050, but that could also need no oil, no coal, no nuclear power, and use a lot less natural gas, all at a savings of $5 trillion. So some people might call that a vision, but if you go through this book, you know it's the result of analysis. Could you run us through that and tell us how you got there, and also tell us if anything has changed due to the economic situation, and basically where we stand now and how we're going to get there?
All in one answer, okay.
Yes.
And by the way, you left out a few other implausible things to believe just after breakfast, namely that this requires no new inventions and no act of Congress, and it's led by business for profit.
Yes.
And it doesn't even include carbon pricing or count any externalities.
And one of the most impressive parts of the book is that it appeals to the profit motive as much as to anything else, or maybe more so.
Well, there's $5 trillion on the table. That should motivate everybody. To get these surprising results, first of all, we had to do a lot of hard work. This is about a $6 million effort, the most ambitious thing we've ever done at RMI. We're not noted for lacking ambition. So this engaged 61 of our 80-odd staff for 6 quarters with a lot of help from industry on both content and peer review. But to get this kind of grand synthesis, we needed to follow advice ascribed to General Eisenhower, although his library has no evidence he actually said it. Namely, if a problem cannot be solved, enlarge it. That is, if you can't solve a tough problem, that's typically not because it isn't small enough to be bite-sized, but rather because it's not big enough for its boundaries to encompass the options and synergies and degrees of freedom that the solution requires. So you have to move the boundaries out till they do. Therefore, we had to integrate all 4 energy-using sectors, transportation, buildings, industry, and electricity. And we had to integrate 4 kinds of innovation, not just the usual 2, technology and public policy, but also 2 that are normally left out but are more powerful: design, the way we combine technologies, and strategy, new competitive strategies, new business models. And those combinations give you a lot more than the sum of the parts, especially in creating deeply disruptive business opportunities. There are 2 big stories here, oil and electricity. They are distinct because our electricity comes less than 1% from oil, but 42% from coal. But their uses are quite concentrated, similarly concentrated. Oil goes 3/4 to transport, and electricity goes 3/4 to buildings. And the rest of both runs industry. So if you make your transport and buildings and industry very efficient, you can save most of the oil and coal, and also natural gas that can displace both of them. And to do that, you use energy in a way that saves money. We found you could triple or quadruple the energy productivity of buildings with a 33% IRR, saving $1.4 trillion net present value. And you can roughly double the energy productivity of industry with a 21% IRR. To get this done by 2050, we would have to ramp up over the next 20 years the level of adoption nationwide to match what the leading states actually did a few years ago. But that doesn't sound implausible given the economic stakes. And by the way, we're not counting positive externalities either. For example, the gains in labor productivity and retail sales and healthcare outcomes and so on in efficient buildings are typically worth 1 and sometimes 2 orders of magnitude more than the energy savings, but we're not counting these non-energy benefits. Now, to get that level of efficiency, we have added to National Academy findings of 3 years ago something they left out, not just some newer technologies that Berkeley Labs documented, but also something out of our Black Swan hatchery called integrative design, which often gives expanding, not diminishing returns to investments in energy efficiency. That is, it often makes very large energy savings cost less than small or no savings by optimizing a building or a factory or a vehicle as a whole system for multiple benefits rather than optimizing isolated components for single benefits. And that's one of the headlines in the book, I think. That argument runs all the way through, and it is missing from all official studies. The Academy actually mentioned it, you can do it in buildings, but they left it out of the conclusions, and they didn't even mention it for industry or vehicles, and not for lack of telling them. But I think it upset the economists, because if you get expanding returns, it makes your models blow up, and that's embarrassing.
Yes. The book is full of a lot of inspiring and sometimes surprising examples of what you just mentioned. Corporations and architects coming up with new designs and new processes that are much more efficient than their predecessors. But at the same time, the book is something of a lament that we're not moving more quickly. And so could you talk about the educational nature of the book and how you want to put it to work to spread the good examples nationwide?
Well, you can't do things you don't know are possible, so we wanted to spread some true stories, some from our own practice, some from others, about what has actually been done, because the surprising findings are actually being implemented a lot faster than you might suppose. Somewhere between 3 and 7 automakers have adopted or are in the course of adopting the breakthrough competitive strategy we described based on ultralighting and electrification. Renewable power supplies are half of the world's net new additions of generating capacity in each of the past 4 years, now dominated by developing countries, by the way, particularly China. And the U.S. has already doubled its energy productivity since '75, but can triple it again at even lower cost because the technologies and integrative design and maturing delivery channels and better financing methods are even better than we had before. Let me give a couple of little examples from buildings just to make this concrete. We co-led the design of the retrofit for the Empire State Building, and it's now saving 2/5 of the energy with a 3-year payback. That is 6 times the saving that an energy service company, very well-known one, had said they could do with a 3-year payback because they didn't do integrative design. And the method is alarmingly simple. In this case, you take out the 6,500 windows at night, and a few at a time, you remanufacture them in a temporary window factory on a vacant floor into super windows that are almost perfect in passing light but blocking heat. And then you combine that with more normal improvements in lighting and lighting controls and day lighting and office equipment. So you end up saving 1/3 of the peak cooling load. But then instead of having to close and tear up Fifth Avenue to dig up the old chillers and replace and expand them, you can renovate them in place and reduce them. That saves $17.5 million, which is over half the total capital cost of the energy work. So you end up paying $13 million instead of 30, and hence the 4-year payback. Or in my own house, we are now ripening the latest 5 of 42 banana crops at 7,100 feet or 2,200 meters in the Rocky Mountains, where it used to go to minus 47F, minus 44C. And we have no heating system, and it was $1,100 cheaper to build it that way. So then when we reinvested that money and a little more with a 10-month payback, we were also able to save 99% of the water heating energy and 90% of the electricity. And the 10-month payback would probably be less than zero today. In fact, to find out how much the technologies have improved the last quarter century, we just retrofitted a bunch of new stuff. And when we're through commissioning the software that's measuring 300 data streams, I'll be able to tell you how much better it is. The trouble is the monitoring system seems to be using more energy than the lights and appliances we're monitoring. Or a simple industrial example, or it could be from a building. The biggest use of electricity is for motors, and the biggest use of motors is to run pumps and fans, moving fluids through pipes and ducts. But the way the textbooks say to size and lay out the pipes and ducts is wrong, because they left out the capital cost of the fluid moving equipment. So if you get the methodology right, you end up saving 80 or 90% of the pumping or fan energy, and typically the capital cost goes down because the pump and fan equipment and the motors and the electricals and so on all get smaller. This is not rocket science. This is rearranging our mental furniture as designers. Or an example from vehicles. I brought a carbon cap along. This is a test piece for military helmets now shipping. And let's see what sort of sound it makes. We can pass this around. Let's see here. Yeah. Don't worry about breaking it. It's tougher than titanium. Tom Friedman whacked it as hard as he could with a sledgehammer and couldn't even scuff it. But, oh, pretty good fit. Italian 1912 style, yeah. So this stuff, this part was made 7 years ago in 1 minute, and the techniques one of our spin-offs developed for doing that can be scaled to automotive cost and speed with aerospace performance. Why does this matter? Well, 2/3 of the energy it takes to move an auto is caused by its weight. And every unit of energy you save at the wheels avoids 6 units lost between engine and wheels or in the engine, that you don't need to waste getting the energy to the wheels. So you save 7 units back at the tank, huge leverage. So by making autos out of this stuff, you can take out about 2/3 of the weight and 2/3, along with drag reductions and stuff, of the energy it takes to move the auto. And that turns out to be free because this radically simplifies automaking, and it also makes the powertrain 2/3 smaller. So with that free 2/3 reduction in tractive load, you can then afford to electrify the vehicle and get not just half off oil, but all off oil. And you then engage 3 very powerful learning curves in the ultralight materials, their structural manufacturing, and the electric powertrain, all of which are so synergistic that it's really hard for competitors to catch up. The first 3 electrified carbon fiber cars are entering mass production in Germany next year.
Yeah, which gets us to the issue of technological leadership. One of the points made in your book is exactly that. It follows up the comment on the European automakers, and with a mention that we could be leading this, meaning the United States could be leading this technological advance, but it's not. And one of the questions is why not, and how can that change? To quote your book again, the chief obstacle, and this is to an efficient, clean energy economy, is not technology or economic or the economics, but simply slow adoption. How do you speed that up? A lot of what you've been talking about sounds very similar to what I hear from companies like Daikin, the air conditioner maker, or Nidec, the motor maker. Corporations are not reading these out-of-date textbooks. at least not some corporations. What's the competitive situation here, and what are the risks and the opportunities for American business?
Well, we invented many of the renewable technologies, but say 2005 to 10, the mighty industrial power of Portugal went from 17 to 45% renewable electricity, while the U.S. crawled from 9 to 10%. In 2010, the Congress, for about the fifth time, messed with the tax law and cut wind installations in the U.S. in half, while in China they doubled for the fourth or fifth year running, and they pulled ahead of us. This is all self-inflicted. However, I think one of the virtues of the Reinventing Fire approach is that it's trans-ideological. That is, whether you most care about profits and jobs and competitive advantage, or about national security, or about environmental stewardship and climate protection and public health, you can do the same things anyway and not need to agree about which one or more of those outcomes you like, whether you like all of them, and which one is most important, because we're focusing on outcomes, not motives. So we can get done what needs to be done and makes sense and makes money without the need for political consensus about why we're doing it. That's a very useful attribute these days. And by the way, some public policy changes are required, for example, to reward utilities for cutting your bill, not for selling you more energy. We've only fixed that in 14 states. 36 still reward the opposite of what we want, which is just as dumb as it sounds. But the needed policy changes can all be done administratively or at a state level, therefore no act of Congress required. So we're using our most effective institutions, private enterprise co-evolving with civil society, sped by military innovation, to end run our least effective institutions.
So you can get around the political gridlock.
Yeah. I was briefing a previous book in '04, our Pentagon co-sponsored Winning the Oil Endgame, ahead of publication on the Hill, both sides, both houses. The Republicans held both houses at the time. And when I was through, the most senior Republican Senate staffer said, "I'm really glad you're not coming up here to ask us to do something, because we would just screw it up." Even more true today, of course.
A couple of questions on the energy mix in the United States. It's changing very rapidly now with natural gas.
Yeah, coal has actually lost 2005 through 10, 1/4 of its share of the electricity services market, which is 95% of its market, and that's just going to accelerate. It turns out the coal-fired power plants can all be displaced at less than their operating cost by efficiency and gas, and they can all be displaced over 23 times with efficiency, gas, and renewables at less than their replacement costs, but you only need to replace them once.
Yeah, and you mentioned also in the book that it's not just coal. Nuclear is already not competitive.
Oh, it died of an incurable attack of market forces a very long time ago. In fact, the past 7 years we've been running an experiment by offering 100+% subsidies for new nuclear construction, and not one of the 34 proposed projects could raise a penny of private construction capital because there's no business case. Similarly, worldwide there are 60-odd units listed as under construction, 10 of which have been so listed for over 20 years, by the way. But every one of them was bought by central planners.
And they're still doing it. There's new ones in the United States that are being built, right?
Well, including what I just described.
Yes.
No private construction capital because no business case.
And no private insurance.
Well, that goes without saying, but you can, they're only buildable if you compulsorily finance them by the taxpayers or the customers or some combination, which is what we're doing. But I think I wouldn't give much of a bet that the Georgia plants will ever be finished. They clearly have no business case even when there's still a hole in the ground.
in order to get off oil by 2050 or sometime in the reasonably near future, there's things that have to be done by business, by government, but what about us? What can individuals do to help reach the goals that you lay out in your book?
Well, pay attention, learn what you can do, vote with your dollars, not just your ballots. Companies are exquisitely sensitive to what you do or don't buy. The household choices matter a lot too, so whenever you're buying something, get the most efficient you can and use it thoughtfully. There is a lot more detail in the book about what each actor in each of the 4 sectors needs to do at 3 levels of adventurousness, ranging from no-brainers to cutting edge. But I think setting a good example is also very important, because a lot of people watch what you do. And in the communities in which you circulate, geographic, interest, faith, ethnicity, whatever, you will have a lot of influence, especially the kinds of people in this room have a big surface area. The things we need to do are not very complicated. You know, we've gotten into this energy mess by millions, if not billions, of individual choices that were not very well informed or thought through. We can get out of it by millions or billions of smarter choices using existing technology.
Okay, well, thank you. I think it's time to let everyone in the audience have their shot. And so if there are any questions, please raise your hand and come up to the mic.
Here comes one. Here come 2.
Amory, many of us, of course, we very much admire your work, Amory, over the years, especially on efficiency, the things that you lay out in your book. One of the biggest concerns in recent year for me has been natural gas, and for many environmentalists, with methane release around new wells, with hydrofracking, and yet at the same time, natural gas is such a so preferable to burning oil and coal and some of the other ways. How do you reconcile the next few years amount of money that's flowing into natural gas drilling, the public relations campaign around clean gas and hydrofracking?
Yep. We concluded that even with a 2.6-fold bigger economy, the U.S. would need at most a third less gas than now. There are at least 8 major uncertainties around fracking. If they're all favorably resolved, we'll have more cheaper gas than the futures market tells us, and that could be a good thing. But if not, we won't be unduly disappointed, because we weren't going to need that much gas anyway. And by the way, it's not as cheap as commonly supposed, because when people talk about cheap gas, they're referring to the bare commodity price without properly adding the value of the volatility of that price. Over a reasonable time horizon, for comparison with durable assets, efficiency, and renewables that have no fuel and therefore no fuel price volatility, the volatility is actually worth as much as the gas has lately been selling for. So that's a factor 2 or more understatement of how cheap the gas really is. I'm actually just drafting a proposed Wall Street Journal op-ed on this subject. There's a lot of hot air about cheap gas, and 3 times in the last 15 years people have had a mania about cheap gas that turned out not to be as cheap as they thought, and one of those times the investors lost over $100 billion. We seem to have fairly short memories. These prices are volatile, and just from a risk management point of view, we ought to put a lot more investment into things that, once you build them, have constant and predictable price. Efficiency, renewables do that. So you ought to have quite a lot of that in your portfolio, even if it costs more, which it doesn't. It costs less now. For the same reason, with the same mathematics, that you should have a good chunk of treasuries in your financial portfolio, even if they yield less, just to optimize the risk-reward ratio of the whole portfolio. And if you don't properly count risk when you compare cost, it's as if you constructed a portfolio of all junk bonds and no treasuries, looking only at price and not at risk. You wouldn't do that for long.
So I have sort of a consumerish question. So it strikes me that in almost all of our houses we have a hot loop and a cold loop. You know, we're running the air conditioner, producing waste heat outside, and then we're running a fire underneath the water downstairs in the basement to make sure that we can take a warm shower. And it's been very surprising as you look at the available technologies that are out there, the ability to recycle or take advantage of any of that capturing of waste energy that's created either in the cooling loop or in the heating loop seems to have no interest at all. Actually, if you type it in and you go searching around, it's almost impossible to find products where you could integrate, for example, heat capture in a refrigerator using, using circulating water in your house, et cetera.
It's a good business opportunity, and actually in the PG&E Act Squared experiment in the early 90s, we did this in a Davis house that provides superior comfort with no air conditioning up to 113F. Later we did the same thing at 115, 46C, and it would be cheaper than normal to build. And one of the tricks we did there was to have a water-cooled refrigerator, preheating the hot water, which makes it more efficient and gives you some free hot water, but it also means that the refrigerator turns into a space cooling device because the hot water leaves the house, whereas the heat from the refrigerator otherwise would just heat the house. You'd have to take the heat away. So yes, thermal integration in all kinds of buildings and industries is a great deal. Let me just mention, I forgot to earlier finish the story about that little object we're passing around. So you get the free ultralighting in the auto. You save lives because the stuff absorbs 6 to 12 times as much crash energy per kilo as steel and does so more smoothly. But that object represents the oil saving, if we did this in all U.S. autos, of 1.5 Saudis or half an OPEC. And the ultralighting is free, but if you add the electrification that it makes affordable, then you can get completely off oil in autos for about $18 a barrel. Or if you then triple the efficiency of the trucks and planes, you end up needing, with productive use, only at most 3 million barrels a day of biofuels, which you can do 2/3 from waste, no cropland required, no soil or climate damage, and you therefore end up getting transport completely off oil at an average cost of about $25 a barrel instead of buying oil for over $100. That's cheaper by $4 trillion net present value, not counting just the economic and military externalities, which would triple that value.
Well, we're running out of time. Does anyone want to slip under the wire here? Another question? If you move quickly, we'll beat the clock here.
Yeah. One problem is that there's no robustness in our solar systems. How many American homes have solar on their roofs now?
I don't know, but it must be 10 to the 6 or so.
Yes, somewhere around the building. And in a power outage, all of them shut off.
Not mine,
Yeah. Do you have battery backup?
yes, but I also have efficiency, so I don't need many batteries. I'm using 1/10 the normal amount of electricity, and that was, part of the 10-month payback in 1983.
Well, I would think that it would be a matter of national urgency to get somebody to offer a $300 box that when you're cut off from the grid, your solar cells still work for your house.
The Pentagon is moving its power supply off the grid because they need their stuff to work, and therefore their default design is islandable netted microgrids. Microgrids that normally interconnect but can stand alone at need. They can disconnect fractally, reconnect seamlessly, and run at least critical loads with or without the grid. My house does that. The whole house is an uninterruptible power supply. So I wrote this book on a tower computer with no UPS because the house is a UPS. We had like 5 power outages in February in the thick of the writing, and I never lost data. Nary a glitch. That turns out to be, however, not the only way to get reliable power from renewables. It just takes advantage of the fact that 98 or 99% of power failures originate in the grid, and about 95% of those originate in the distribution system. So if you can bypass that, you get 1 or 2 orders of magnitude gain in reliability right away. But the National Renewable Energy Lab will publish in the first week of June an important study using the same model we used. And they showed that you can cost effectively and reliably run a 80 or 90% renewable U.S. electricity supply. And we showed how to go to 100%. And this does not actually require bulk power storage as commonly assumed. That is, if you diversify the variable renewables, wind and photovoltaics, by location and type, and you forecast them and you integrate them with flexible resources already on the grid, both supply and demand side, all the moving parts fit together nicely without needing bulk storage, which would be a 6th method, but a more expensive one, although compressed air storage is reasonable. So we don't need a storage breakthrough to have all renewable electricity supply. The surprising thing we found about electricity is, you know, when we replace the whole system, as we pretty much have to by 2050, whether we replace it with more of what we've got, or new nuclear and clean coal, or centralized renewables, or more distributed renewables, it's going to cost about the same regardless, about $6 trillion net present value, but the risks differ profoundly. And the only future that manages all those risks, and the only one that manages the risk of cascading blackouts that could shatter the economy, is the distributed renewable future with this inherently resilient architecture of netted islandable microgrids. It's also the best for entrepreneurial opportunity and innovation and customer choice. So I think it's where we're headed.
Well, thank you very much. And that's sure I appreciate you joining us.